My son-in-law knocked my coffee cup off the kitchen table and told me I had two choices. Either I lace up an apron, learn to make myself useful around the house and start treating him with the respect a man of his position deserved, or I collect my things and get out of his sight permanently. My daughter, the girl I had driven to school in the rain every single morning for 9 years because she was afraid of the bus, stood 4 feet away from him and told me I was being unreasonable. She told me I needed to understand that her husband worked very hard and that a little gratitude from me would go a long way. So I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I am 68 years old, and I have not raised my voice in anger since the day I buried my wife, and I was not about to break that record for a man like Marcus Becker. I smiled instead. It was a quiet smile, the kind that comes not from happiness, but from the particular calm of a man who has been waiting 3 months for a conversation to reach its logical conclusion. I pushed back from the kitchen table, walked down the hall to the guest room, and opened the wardrobe. My suitcase was already packed. I had packed it 11 days ago. They thought they were ejecting a retired civil engineer who had nothing left but a modest pension and an old Volvo with high mileage. They thought they were cutting loose a burden who had overstayed his welcome in their beautiful house in the Schwabing district of Munich. What they did not know, what I had been careful for 3 months to make absolutely certain they would not know until the precise moment I chose to reveal it, was that the beautiful house in Schwabing was mine. The mortgage had been paid in full in my name through a private holding company I had established 17 years ago. The 2 cars in the garage, the Audi and the Range Rover, were leased under that same company. The kitchen renovation Marcus had overseen so proudly 6 months ago, the one with the Italian marble worktops and the professional-grade gas range, had been funded by a transfer from my account to a contractor I had employed directly, and who had invoiced at my quiet instruction a subsidiary entity that Marcus had never once thought to examine. I was not a retired civil engineer with a modest pension and an old Volvo. I was Werner Hoffman, and I had built things they could not imagine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how I got there. Let me tell you about the morning the cup came off the table, because that morning was not the beginning of the story. It was simply the morning everything that had been building for a very long time finally reached the surface and could no longer be ignored. My name is Werner Hoffman. I am 68 years old, and I was born in Regensburg in Bavaria, the second son of a stonemason and a woman who had grown up in a village so small it did not appear on most maps. My father worked with his hands every day of his life, and he was proud of that, as he had every right to be. I grew up understanding that the physical world was built by people who were willing to do difficult things carefully and repeatedly, until the difficult things became the foundation on which everything else rested. I studied civil engineering at the Technical University of Munich on a scholarship I earned by placing second in the state mathematics competition at the age of 17. I graduated with distinction. I went to work for a mid-sized infrastructure firm in Frankfurt, and for 6 years, I learned every technical and commercial dimension of that business from the basement up. Then I left and started my own. Hoffman Engineering Solutions began in 1989 in a rented office above a bakery in the Maxvorstadt district of Munich with 2 employees, one of whom was me, and a contract to survey and assess 3 kilometers of aging municipal drainage infrastructure in the city's eastern suburbs. It was not glamorous work. It required waterproof boots and a tolerance for confined spaces and the ability to write reports that bureaucratic committees would actually read and act upon. I had all 3. Within 4 years, we had 15 employees and a reputation for the kind of precision that municipal authorities in Bavaria valued above almost everything else. Within 10 years, we had 42 employees. Offices in Munich, Frankfurt, and Vienna, and a project portfolio that included 2 major bridge rehabilitation contracts, a tunnel assessment program for the Austrian Federal Highway Authority, and the drainage infrastructure planning for an entire new district being developed on the eastern edge of Munich. I built the company with my wife Katerina. She was not an engineer. She had studied economics at Munich, and she understood money the way I understood concrete and steel, with a precise and unromantic clarity that cut through everything irrelevant and went directly to the structural question. She handled the finances, the contracts, the employment decisions, and the relationships with the banking institutions that provided the capital we needed to grow. I handled the technical work, the project management, the client relationships, and the day-to-day operations. We were a good partnership. We were also for 31 years an extraordinarily good marriage. She was funny and a dry. quiet way that only became apparent after you had known her for some time. She was honest to a degree that occasionally made social situations slightly uncomfortable, but that made everything between the two of us absolutely clear and trustworthy. She was the best person I've ever known, and when she died of a sudden cardiac event 3 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon in October, sitting at her desk in the office reviewing a contract amendment. My structural understanding of the world underwent a revision from which it has not entirely recovered. Our daughter's name is Sophia. Sophia was born in 1992, and from the very beginning she was her mother's daughter in appearance and her father's daughter in certain stubborn habits of mind that I recognized with the helpless recognition of seeing yourself reflected in someone who has every right to be their own person. She was clever and she was funny, and she was for the first 22 years of her life one of the great pleasures of my existence. She studied communications at the Ludwig Maximilian University, which was not the choice I would have made for her, but which was absolutely the right choice for her specifically, because Sophia had a gift for understanding how people processed information and what made them pay attention and what made them close their minds. She graduated in 2015 and went to work at a medium-sized marketing agency in Munich, where she was by every account I could find genuinely talented at her work. She met Marcus Becker at a conference in Hamburg in 2017. He was 34 at the time, 5 years older than Sophia, and he was employed as a senior brand strategist at a larger agency. He was handsome in the specific assembled way of men who have identified their physical appearance as a professional asset and maintained it accordingly. He was articulate, and he was charming, and he had, as I would come to understand over the following years, a very sophisticated sense of exactly how much of himself to reveal to any given person in order to produce the maximum favorable impression. When he came to our house for dinner for the first time, he brought a bottle of wine that was expensive enough to signal appreciation, but not so expensive as to seem like he was trying too hard. He asked me 3 questions about my work that were intelligent enough to demonstrate he had done some research, but not so specific as to suggest an agenda. He was in the vocabulary of my profession, structurally sound on the surface. I did not look carefully enough at the subsurface. Katerina looked more carefully. She said to me afterwards in the kitchen, while we were loading the dishwasher, that Marcus Becker had spent the entire evening managing impressions, and that she was not certain he had said a single thing that was straightforwardly true about himself. I told her she was being too suspicious. She gave me the look she reserved for moments when I was being professionally precise about engineering and personally imprecise about everything else, and she did not push the point. I wish she had pushed harder. I wish I'd listened better. But I was 59 years old, and my daughter was radiant with happiness, and I'd always trusted my own structural assessments, and this time I got the assessment wrong. They were engaged in 2019 and married in June of 2020. The wedding was small because of the pandemic restrictions, but it was beautiful, held in the garden of a hotel outside Munich, with 22 guests and a cellist that Katerina had found through a connection at the university. 3 months after the wedding, Katerina had her first cardiac event. It was a warning, the cardiologist said. A serious one. She reduced her hours at the company. She rested more. She seemed to be managing it. Then in October 2021, she sat down at her desk at 3:15 in the afternoon and did not stand up again. The grief of that period is not something I'm going to describe to you in detail, because it belongs to me, and it was private, and I have no interest in performing it. What I will tell you is that in the months immediately following Katerina's death, I made several decisions that I would come to understand as mistakes. I sold my majority stake in Hoffman Engineering Solutions to a private equity firm for a figure that I will not specify, except to say that it was significant, more significant than anyone who had known me as a civil engineer in waterproof boots would have guessed. I retained a small advisory role that paid a retainer and required very little of my time. I restructured the company's subsidiary holdings and the private trusts that Katerina and I had established over the years, and I did this carefully with my lawyer Gerhard Weiss, who had advised us for 20 years and who knew our affairs in their entirety. I also, because I was 65 years old and recently widowed and in a state of emotional disorientation that I was attempting to manage through activity and practical problem-solving, agreed to Sophia's suggestion that I sell my apartment in Schwabing and move into the house. The house had been a wedding gift. I had purchased it through the holding company Hoffman Immobilien GmbH and structured the arrangement so that Sophia and Marcus believed they were renting it from a private landlord at a below-market rate, when in reality the nominal rent they paid was simply a mechanism to maintain the legal fiction of an arm's-length arrangement that Gerhard had advised as appropriate for tax and inheritance purposes. They didn't know the property was mine. They didn't know who the landlord was. They received their rental invoices from a property management company that Gerhard's office administered, and they paid without question because the amount was genuinely attractive, and Marcus, whatever his faults was, not someone who looked too carefully at favorable arrangements. When Sophia suggested I move in, she framed it as a mutual benefit. I would have company and purpose and would not rattle around alone in my apartment. She and Marcus would have help around the house, someone to manage the maintenance issues that Marcus found tedious, someone with a car and availability to handle the practical logistics of daily life. It seemed on the surface like a reasonable arrangement. I moved in January of 2022. Within 6 weeks, I understood that I had made a significant error. Marcus had a particular relationship with domestic space that I can only describe as territorial. He moved through the house with a confidence that went beyond comfort and became quite quickly a form of constant low-level assertion. He left his things everywhere and reacted with visible irritation when they were moved. He occupied the kitchen at unpredictable times and made it subtly but consistently clear that my presence there at the same time was an inconvenience. He made comments about the noise I made when I was working at the kitchen table in the evenings, about my habits of waking early, about the way I organized the recycling, which he described as unnecessarily meticulous. Each individual comment was small enough to be dismissed as the friction of shared living. Taken together over weeks and then months, they assembled into something that had a clear architectural purpose to define my position in the household as subordinate and contingent. Sophia watched this happen and said very little. This was the part that cost me more than any specific act of Marcus's. I had raised a person of considerable intelligence and considerable backbone, or so I had believed, and what I was observing was that intelligence in the presence of a particular kind of daily social pressure can become something that works in exactly the wrong direction. Sophia was not stupid. She could see what was happening, but she had built an entire life around this marriage and around the version of Marcus she had chosen to believe in, and anything that threatened the stability of that construction was a threat to her in a way that I, her aging father sleeping in the guest room, was simply not equipped to compete with. So she managed her own perception. She told herself I was being oversensitive. She told Marcus I was having a hard time adjusting to retirement. She smoothed things over with the particular efficiency of someone who has become very good at not seeing what they are seeing. The months went by. I paid attention. I had spent 40 years in an industry where inattention to structural conditions was how disasters happened, and I applied the same professional discipline to the situation I was living inside. I want to describe specifically what paying attention looked like in that house, because it is important to understand that I was not a bitter old man cataloging grievances. I was an engineer assessing a structure. I was looking for the load-bearing elements and the places where the load was being applied incorrectly, and the points at which failure, if nothing was corrected, would occur. I noted, for instance, that Marcus had 2 modes of operation in the house. The first was the public mode, the mode he deployed when Sophia's friends came for dinner, or when the couple in the apartment below, a young doctor and his partner, stopped in for drinks on a Saturday evening. In public mode, Marcus was expansive and generous and funny in a sharp, quick way that I could see was genuinely effective. He poured wine with the enthusiasm of a man who cared about your enjoyment. He asked questions that sounded interested. He laughed at things other people said with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. He was in public mode, someone you would seek out at a party. The second mode was the one I lived with every day. It was not violent in any way that would be recognizable to someone who had not been inside it. It was the mode of constant small calibrations. A question asked in a tone that contained within it the implication that the answer was going to be inadequate. A pause before responding to something I had said that communicated without words, that the thing I had said was not worth the effort of a prompt reply. A habit of addressing me without making eye contact, not always but frequently enough that when he did make eye contact, it felt like a deliberate act of notice, as if he was granting me a moment of being seen. These were not things you could report to anyone and have them understand the cumulative weight of. They were the structural equivalent of micro cracks in concrete, individually invisible, collectively indicating a fundamental problem in the material. I also noted the dynamics between Marcus and Sophia. They had from the outside the appearance of a partnership between equals. Sophia was intelligent and professionally successful, and Marcus was careful in public to acknowledge this. He said things about her work that sounded like admiration. But inside the house, in the day-to-day fabric of how decisions were made and how space was allocated and how each person's preferences and requirements were weighted, the picture was different. Marcus's preferences governed almost everything: what was eaten when it was eaten, what temperature the house was kept at, what music was played, which social invitations were accepted and which declined. These were individually small things, but they were also taken together the complete topography of a shared life, and in this house, the topography tilted entirely in one direction. Sophia managed this through a kind of perpetual accommodation that she had, I think, largely stopped recognizing as accommodation. She had internalized it as simply the way their life was structured, the way their specific personalities and preferences combined. She had forgotten, if she had ever fully known, that a life structured entirely around one person's preferences is not a partnership but a service arrangement, and that the person providing the service always pays a cost that is not visible until the debt becomes impossible to carry. I took note of Marcus's finances, which were not healthy. His agency work paid well, but his spending significantly exceeded his income, and he managed this through a combination of credit facilities, occasional consulting income, and the fact that the house and the cars, without his knowledge, cost him considerably less than they would have on the open market. I noted the conversations he had on the phone in his home office, which carried through the thin wall of the guest room with more clarity than he seemed to realize. I noted the name of the business partner he was investing with, a man named Daniel Gruber, who described himself as a boutique investment advisor and whose actual professional history I had Gerhard's office research quietly and thoroughly. What Gerhard's researcher found about Daniel Gruber was interesting in a specific and troubling way that I will return to. I also, during these months, did something that I had been planning since before I moved in but had not yet executed. I had the property management company quietly restructure the rental terms of the house in a way that was internally documented but not communicated to the tenants. I refreshed the holding company's registration and updated the beneficial ownership documentation. I worked with Gerhard to establish a secondary trust structure that would allow for the rapid withdrawal of the financial arrangements that underpinned Marcus and Sophia's daily life if I determined that such action was necessary and appropriate. I did not want to take that action. I wanted the situation to improve. But I had been an engineer for 40 years, and I knew that when a structure shows progressive signs of loading failure, you do not wait until the collapse to prepare the remediation. The morning the coffee cup came off the table was in September. It was a Tuesday. The light through the kitchen windows was the particular low gold of early autumn in Bavaria, the light that always reminded me of Katerina and of the years when Sophia was small, and the mornings were full of the good ordinary noise of a family moving through a shared day. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a technical journal I'd been reading. Something I had started doing again as a way of maintaining the part of my mind that needed precision and structure to feel like itself. The house was quiet. Marcus had a client meeting in the afternoon and had come down late, which was usual. He walked into the kitchen, and he didn't say good morning. He had not said good morning to me once in 8 months. He opened the refrigerator, found that the specific brand of orange juice he preferred was not in it, and turned to look at me with an expression that I had come to recognize as the prelude to a particular kind of interaction. "Werner," he said. He always used my name in a specific way, without prefix, without warmth, the way you might call a household appliance by its model designation. I did not look up from the journal. "Good morning, Marcus," I said. "Did you use the last of the Valencina?" he said. I looked up. "I do not drink orange juice," I said. "I have not bought or used orange juice in this house at any point in the 8 months I have lived here." He looked at me for a moment. Then he came to the table, reached past me, and picked up the salt cellar. He turned it in his hand for a moment. Then he put it down, but further from my reach than it had been, a deliberate small repositioning of an object in his space. He did this routinely with things on the kitchen table. He did it with my journal occasionally, sliding it an inch or two toward the edge, never quite off, just repositioned to remind me of the allocation of territory. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, which was unusual. He normally stood when he spoke to me. Sitting meant he intended this to take some time. I closed the journal. "Sophia and I have been discussing the household arrangements," he said. He had the tone of a man who had prepared for this conversation and was now delivering a position that had been agreed in advance. He used words like arrangements and going forward and contribution quite a lot. The substance of what he said was this: that I had been living in the house for 8 months, and that in his assessment I was not contributing adequately to the running of the household, that my presence created more work than it offset, that he and Sophia had discussed it, and felt that if I was going to continue to live there, it would need to be on a different basis. One where I was more actively involved in the domestic management of the property, by which he meant cooking, cleaning, shopping, managing contractors, and being generally available to handle the logistical requirements of the house during the hours when they were both working. In other words, he said, and now his tone shifted into the register that I had learned to recognize as the one he used when he had decided that enough groundwork had been laid to say the actual thing: you need to earn your place here, Werner. You need to make yourself useful. Otherwise, to be honest with you, I do not see the arrangement continuing. I looked at him. I thought about all the things I could have said. I could have told him what I knew about Daniel Gruber. I could have put Gerhard's research document on the table in front of him. I could have told him the real situation regarding the house, the cars, the kitchen renovation, the holding company, the 3 separate financial support structures that were at that very moment underpinning his lifestyle. I could have watched his face change from the studied command he was projecting to something quite different. I didn't do any of that, not yet. I said, I appreciate you being direct with me, Marcus. I will think about what you have said. He looked slightly thrown by this. He had expected either capitulation or confrontation, and he had received neither. He nodded, stood up, and left the kitchen with his coffee. 2 days later, Sophia came to my room in the evening. She sat on the chair by the window, the chair where I kept my reading and which I had cleared and offered to her because she was my daughter. And I had been offering her the best available chair since she was 3 years old. She had the particular expression she wore when she was about to say something that she had been rehearsing and that she knew I was not going to like. Papa, she said. She only used the German form when she was trying to reach something older and more fundamental between us. She told me that Marcus had spoken to her and that she agreed with him. She told me that she could see I was not happy, which was true, and that the arrangement was creating tension, which was also true, and that she thought it would be better for everyone, including me, if I considered whether I might be more comfortable in my own space. She said this carefully, softly, with the eyes of someone who is doing a thing they know is wrong and have found a way to describe to themselves as being for the best. I listened to all of it. Then I said, Sophia, are you asking me to leave? She looked out of the window for a moment. I'm saying that maybe it would be better, she said. I nodded. I said I would think about it. After she left, I sat in the chair and I thought about Katerina. I thought about the last conversation we had had in that office in October 2021. 3 weeks before she died, when she had told me with the directness that was entirely characteristic of her, that she was worried about Sophia and Marcus, and that she thought I didn't see Marcus clearly enough and that I should pay more attention. I had listened and nodded and not paid enough attention. I was paying it now. I called Gerhard the next morning. The conversation was not long. Gerhard had been expecting it in the way that careful lawyers expect calls from careful clients when circumstances develop to the point where preparation must become action. I told him the situation. He confirmed the readiness of the instruments we had prepared. I gave him 3 instructions. He said he would have everything in order within 48 hours. That evening, I packed my suitcase. The morning Marcus knocked the coffee cup off the table, I was sitting in the kitchen at 6:45. I had not slept particularly well, but I was not tired in the way that comes from exhaustion. I was alert in the way that comes from clarity. The cup was not a dramatic gesture on his part, not in the way that outright violence is dramatic. He walked past me, paused, turned, and with the back of his hand swept it off the table in a single motion, then looked at me as if daring me to react. He said the cleaning woman had quit probably because of me and that someone needed to clean the house before his clients came on Friday and that he expected me to handle it. I want to be precise about what happened in that kitchen, because the external facts do not fully capture the internal dimensions. When Marcus swept the cup off the table, he didn't do it in a rage. He wasn't shouting or red-faced or out of control. He did it with a deliberateness that was, if anything, more disturbing than if he had been in a rage, because it was the action of a man who has calculated that he can do this thing and that the person it is being done to will absorb it without consequence to himself. He did it the way you move an object that is in your way. He did it because I was to him an object in his way, and the cup was simply the most convenient expression of that assessment. He stood over me after doing it, and he told me that my presence in the house had been a source of disruption from the beginning and that Sophia agreed with him, and that if I was not going to contribute, then I was not going to stay. He used the word contribute 4 times in approximately 90 seconds. He told me that men of his position, he used that phrase, men of his position, did not have time to manage the complications that came with elderly relatives who had not adapted to the realities of modern household dynamics. He was lecturing me. He was standing in a kitchen that I owned beside cars that I had paid for in a life that was structurally dependent on my invisible financial support, and he was lecturing me about reality. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it was not what you might expect. I did not feel rage, though I think rage would have been a reasonable response. I did not feel the injured outrage of a father who has been disrespected by the man his daughter chose. What I felt was something closer to the feeling I had had on 3 occasions in 40 years of engineering when I had assessed a structure and confirmed that what I had been suspecting for some time was in fact true, that the failure I had identified as a possibility was in fact a certainty, and that the only remaining question was the manner and timing of the remediation. I felt clarified. Sophia was at the kitchen doorway. She had her work bag over her shoulder and her keys in her hand, and she was going to be late. And she looked at her father and at the coffee spreading across the floor and at her husband, and she said, "Papa Marcus has a big week. Can you just please help him out?" It was not a question. I looked at the floor. I looked at the coffee. I thought about the stonemason in Regensburg and the scholarship in the bakery office and the 40 years of building things carefully and the woman at the desk in October and the daughter I had driven to school in the rain, and the chair I had always offered, and the suitcase 11 days packed in the wardrobe. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man checking the final item on a list that has been building for a very long time. I stood up from the table. I didn't clean the coffee. I walked to the guest room and opened the wardrobe and took out the suitcase. I walked back through the kitchen, through the hall, and to the front door. "Where are you going?" Marcus called from the kitchen doorway. He sounded more surprised than angry. He had expected either compliance or argument, and he was receiving something he did not have a category for. I opened the front door. I turned and looked at him, and then at Sophia, who was standing behind him, with her keys still in her hand. Her face had gone very still. "I'm going to Gerhard's office," I said. "There are some property matters I need to finalize." The word property registered in Marcus's face in a small but visible way. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a fractional adjustment of his expression towards something more cautious. "I will be in touch," I said. I put the suitcase in the Volvo and drove to Gerhard Weiss's office on Maximilianstrasse, where I had been going for 20 years to discuss the structures that governed the practical realities of my life. Gerhard had a corner office with a view of the street and a habit of preparing excellent coffee without being asked. He was 63 years old, silver-haired, and had the bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades watching careful people navigate difficult situations, and who had consequently developed a very precise understanding of when to speak and when to be quiet. He handed me a coffee, a real one, and sat down across from me, and we reviewed the sequence of actions that were now going to begin. The first letter arrived at the house 2 days later. It was from the property management company formally notifying the tenants that due to a change in the ownership structure of the property, a full tenancy review would be conducted over the following 30 days, during which time the rental terms would be assessed against current market rates and a revised agreement issued. The letter was professional and cordial, and gave Marcus and Sophia absolutely no indication of what it actually meant or who was behind it. It was signed by the property manager, not by Gerhard, not by me. Gerhard told me later that Marcus had called the property management office the same afternoon. He had been, in Gerhard's restrained description, somewhat agitated. The property manager had confirmed the facts of the letter and indicated that the review process was standard and that they would be contacted within 30 days with further details. Marcus had pushed for the name of the property owner. The property manager had explained that the owner's identity was held by the beneficial ownership trust, and that disclosure was subject to the terms of the trust instrument, and that if Marcus wished to pursue the matter further, he should engage his own legal representation. I was staying at a small hotel near the Englischer Garten. It was not a grand hotel, but it was clean and quiet, and the breakfast was good, and there was a park nearby where I walked every morning at 7:30, which was a habit I had maintained since Katerina and I used to walk there together, and which I was not prepared to surrender to any circumstance. I read, I walked. I spoke to Gerhard twice a day. I did not call Sophia, and she did not call me. The silence on Sophia's side lasted longer than I had expected. I had thought she would call within a day, perhaps two, when the immediate shock of the property letter had settled enough for her to separate it from the general shock of my departure and begin to think clearly about what it meant. I had miscalculated. She did not call for 5 days. And in those 5 days, the silence had a specific quality that I came to understand later was the quality of a person engaged in a very difficult internal reckoning, the kind that cannot be rushed and cannot be interrupted without derailing it. I occupied myself during those days in ways that I hope communicated nothing dramatic. I had breakfast each morning in the hotel dining room, a buffet of the kind that is slightly too elaborate for one person, but that I worked through methodically, because I had learned in the years since Katerina died that the maintenance of ordinary domestic routines in the absence of the person who normally shared them was a form of structural self-respect that I was not going to abandon. I called my colleague in Vienna about the bridge project. I read the 2 technical journals that had been sitting unread on my bedside table for 6 weeks. I walked in the park every morning, and on the 3rd morning, I saw a man feeding ducks at the edge of the lake with what appeared to be a substantial portion of an artisan loaf. And I stood and watched him do it for about 10 minutes with the specific pleasure of a person who has nothing pressing to attend to and has rediscovered the luxury of looking at whatever they want to look at for as long as they find it interesting. On the 4th evening, I had dinner alone at a small Italian restaurant on a side street near the hotel that I had been going to occasionally for 20 years. The owner, a woman named Clara, who had taken over from her father a decade ago, and who had Katerina's same quality of radical directness, asked me where my wife was. I told her. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she was sorry, and she brought me a glass of something from a bottle she kept behind the bar that she did not offer from the menu, and we sat at the bar together for 20 minutes and talked about nothing of importance, and it was one of the most restorative 20 minutes I had spent since Katerina died. Marcus called me on the 4th day. The call lasted approximately 4 minutes and was notable for the degree to which it demonstrated that he had not yet understood the full dimensions of the situation he was in. He told me that he knew I was behind the property letter, and that it was a petty and spiteful response to a conversation that had simply been an honest discussion about household management. He told me that he and Sophia had rights as long-term tenants that I apparently did not understand. He told me that if I continued with whatever I was doing, he would consult a lawyer. I told him consulting a lawyer was an excellent idea. I recommended he do it promptly. Then I ended the call. The second action happened on the 4th day. The leasing company that held the 2 cars contacted Marcus and Sophia to inform them that due to an administrative restructuring of the account, the vehicles had been flagged for return pending a review of the lease arrangement. The letter offered a 30-day notice period and a contact number for questions. The leasing company was a subsidiary of Hoffman Immobilien GmbH, which was mine. The third action happened on the 6th day, and this was the one I had deliberated longest about because it was the most direct and the most personal. For 3 years, I had been quietly paying a monthly amount into a joint household account that Marcus and Sophia used for shared expenses. The payments came from a trust account and appeared on their bank statements as regular standing order receipts from an entity called HB, Familienunterstützung, a name innocuous enough that neither of them had ever questioned it. On the 6th day, Gerhard had the standing order canceled. The amount was not enormous, but it was the margin between their monthly income and their monthly expenditure. And without it, the gap would become visible very quickly. My phone rang that evening at 9:15. It was Sophia. I answered. She didn't say hello. She said, "Papa, what are you doing?" Her voice was different from any way she had spoken to me in the previous 8 months. The management was gone, the rehearsed reasonableness, the careful deployment of patience. She sounded for the first time in a very long time like someone speaking without preparation. "I'm sitting in a hotel room reading a book," I said. "How are you, Sophia?" "Papa." Her voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. "The property, the cars, the money. Is that you? Is all of that you?" I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "The property is mine, yes. It has always been mine. The holding company is mine. The cars are leased under that company. The monthly payment you have been receiving for 3 years is from a trust I established. Gerhard can provide you with the full documentation if you would like to review it." A very long silence. "I don't understand," she said finally. The way she said it was not the way someone says it when they want an explanation. It was the way someone says it when they are beginning to understand, and the understanding is dismantling a significant portion of the architecture of their recent life. You did not need to understand it, I said. I was not doing it because I wanted acknowledgement. I was doing it because you were my daughter and because your mother and I had spent 30 years building things precisely so that the people we loved would be able to live well. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to live normally and not feel like you were dependent on me. I said that last sentence carefully because it was true and because I wanted her to hear the distinction between what I had intended and what had actually occurred. Another silence. Then she said in a voice that had gone very quiet, "Marcus doesn't know any of this." "No," I said. "He's going to," she said. "He's going to want to know everything." "That is between the two of you," I said. "Gerhard will be sending formal documentation to the property address tomorrow regarding the tenancy review. I would encourage you to read it carefully before you discuss it with Marcus." "Papa," she said. Her voice had the quality it had when she was 12 years old and had done something she knew was wrong and was trying to find the formulation that would allow us to move past it without the full reckoning. I remembered that voice. I had always in the past helped her find a way around it. I was not going to do that this time. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because the full reckoning was the only version of this that led anywhere worth going. "I think you should get some sleep," I said. "We can talk properly when you are ready to." I ended the call and looked at the ceiling for a while. The documentation Gerhard sent the next morning was comprehensive and professional and deeply clarifying. It established with the precision of 20 years of careful legal structuring the complete ownership picture of everything Marcus had believed he was managing and controlling and building a life within. The house was mine. The cars were being recalled. The trust payments had ceased. And there was one further item in the package that I had asked Gerhard to include, not as a legal instrument, but as an informational document, the research file on Daniel Gruber. I need to tell you about Daniel Gruber because he is part of the story in a way that became important. Marcus had been introduced to Gruber through a colleague at his agency approximately 14 months earlier. Gruber presented himself as the principal of a boutique investment advisory firm in Zurich. He was, in reality, a man with a history of regulatory investigations in 3 European jurisdictions, 2 of which had concluded with findings that stopped short of prosecution on technical grounds, and 1 of which was still ongoing as of the date of Gerhard's research. His investment advisory operation had a pattern of attracting clients through professional social networks, cultivating trust over a period of 6 to 12 months, and then presenting a high-return structured product opportunity that invariably involved the client committing capital to an entity whose ownership and regulatory status were deliberately obscured. 2 of Gerhard's researchers' sources in the financial sector described the operation as a sophisticated advance fee scheme with additional elements of ongoing financial manipulation. Marcus had invested 140,000 euros with Daniel Gruber over the previous 11 months. I knew this because Marcus's phone calls through the wall of the guest room had been more informative than he had understood. This was why I had included the research file in Gerhard's documentation package. Not as a weapon against Marcus, though I will admit I was not entirely free of the wish to see his carefully maintained confidence meet something it could not manage. I included it because the money Marcus had invested with Gruber was in significant part money that had come from the 3-year trust payments and the below-market housing and the leased cars. Money that had come ultimately from me, and because if I did nothing and said nothing, and Marcus lost all of it, the consequences would fall not just on Marcus, but on Sophia. And regardless of what Sophia had allowed to happen in that kitchen and in that guest room over the preceding months, she was still my daughter, and her mother had made me promise to look after her, and I had every intention of keeping that promise even when it was complicated and even when she had not made it easy. Gerhard told me later that Marcus had called him the morning after receiving the documentation. The call had been in Gerhard's precise description emotionally elevated. Marcus had made various assertions about his legal position regarding the tenancy, some of which demonstrated a partial understanding of the relevant law, and some of which demonstrated a more fundamental misunderstanding of his actual situation. Gerhard had listened to all of it and then had outlined calmly and with the particular unhurried clarity of someone who is prepared very thoroughly for a conversation the actual legal position. He had told Marcus that the property ownership was not in question, that the tenancy terms had been maintained at a below-market rate as a matter of the owner's discretion, and that the owner was now exercising his discretion to review those terms, and that the documentation regarding the car leases was straightforward and did not have a significant legal dimension. He had then directed Marcus's attention to the Daniel Gruber file and had noted without elaboration that the owner of the property had thought it appropriate to include this information as a courtesy. The silence on the other end of the call, Gerhard told me, lasted approximately 15 seconds. Then, Marcus had said that he needed to speak to his wife. I did not hear from either of them for 4 days. I walked in the park. I read. I had dinner with Gerhard one evening, and we talked about the structural engineering project I'd been thinking about returning to in an advisory capacity. I called an old colleague in Vienna, and we had a long conversation about a bridge rehabilitation project he was working on that had developed some interesting complications in the foundation assessment phase. I slept reasonably well. I was not at peace exactly, but I was in the particular state of clarity that follows a long period of accumulated difficulty when the difficulty has finally been addressed directly. It was the clarity of a man who has done what he knew he needed to do and is waiting to see what that produces. Sophia called me on the 5th day. She called at 10:15 in the morning, which meant Marcus had already left for work or for wherever Marcus was going to go, now that a significant number of the assumptions underpinning his daily life had been revised. She said, "Papa, can I come and see you?" I gave her the name of the hotel and told her I would be in the lobby at noon. She arrived at 12:05. She was thinner than she had been in September, not dramatically so, but visibly the way people become thinner when they have been sleeping badly and eating without attention. She was not wearing the kind of clothes she normally wore, the assembled professional appearance that Marcus's professional circle seemed to require. The particular careful put-togetherness that had always struck me as slightly exhausting. She was wearing a plain dark jacket and flat shoes, and her hair was not done in any particular way. She looked more like herself than she had in a very long time. She sat down across from me in the hotel lobby and she looked at her hands for a moment, and then she looked at me. She said, "I owe you an apology that I do not know how to make large enough." I looked at her. I had thought about this moment many times in the previous weeks. I had thought about what I wanted from it, what I needed, what would actually serve both of us, versus what would feel satisfying in the short term and accomplish nothing in the long term. I had thought about what Katerina would have said. Katerina would have been direct. She would not have performed forgiveness she did not yet feel. But she would not have withheld genuine recognition of the courage it took for Sophia to be sitting across from me, saying those words. I said, "Tell me what you're apologizing for, not so that I can judge whether it is adequate, so that I know you understand what happened." She looked up at me. She nodded slowly. She said, "I watched him treat you badly, and I told myself it was manageable. I told myself you were being oversensitive, and that he was under pressure, and that it was temporary. I watched him knock your breakfast off the table, and I told him he was right. I stood there while he spoke to my father, like he was the help, and I agreed with him." She stopped. She looked at her hands again. "I chose him over you every time. Not because I loved him more, because I was afraid of what it would mean to choose you. I was afraid of what I would have to admit about the life I had built if I admitted that what was happening to you was real." I sat with that for a moment. It was honest. It was the most honest thing she had said to me in 2 years, and possibly the most honest thing she had said about her marriage to herself. It did not fix anything, but it was the beginning of what fixing things would require. I said, "The Daniel Gruber situation. Have you spoken to Marcus?" She took a breath. "Yes." She paused. "He has lost most of it. He thought he was going to make enough to—" She searched for the word to change our position. Those were his words, to change our position. He thought the investments were going to give him the financial independence he needed to stop feeling like she stopped again. "To stop feeling like he was living in my shadow," I said. She looked at me. "He never said that to me directly, but yes, that is what I think it was." I understood something from this that I had not fully understood before. Marcus was not simply a man of selfish habits and an aggressive temperament. He was a man who had looked at the financial and structural reality of his domestic life, sensed the invisible presence of something larger than himself without being able to identify it precisely, and responded to that sensing with the weapons available to him, which were control assertion and the gradual diminishment of the most visible symbol of his dependency. He had been trying to dominate the house because he could feel without knowing why that the house was not truly his. He had been trying to make me feel small because somewhere in his instincts he understood that I was not small, and that understanding frightened him. This did not excuse any of it. Understanding a structural failure does not mean you are not responsible for maintaining the structure, but it helped me place it accurately. I said, "What do you want, Sophia?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to know that there is still something between us that I have not destroyed. I want to know that you are my father and I am your daughter, and that those words still mean what they are supposed to mean, even after everything that has happened in the last 2 years. I looked at her. I thought about the rain and the morning drives and the oatmeal in the kitchen, and the suitcase packed 11 days early, and the chair I had always offered, and the promise I had made in October 2021 beside a desk where the best person I had ever known was no longer sitting. Those words mean what they are supposed to mean, I said. They always have. That was never in question. She pressed her lips together very hard for a moment. Then she said, "What do I do now?" I said, "What do you want to do?" She thought about it seriously, the way she had always thought about serious questions, when she was a child with her whole face engaged and her eyes looking at something that was not in the room. She said, "I want to know how to be a person who is capable of the things I was not capable of in that house. I want to understand how that happened, how I became someone who stood there and said nothing." "Those are the right questions," I said. "They are not questions I can answer for you. But asking them honestly is the beginning of being able to answer them." We sat in the hotel lobby for 2 more hours. We talked about her mother. We talked about things that had happened before Marcus. Things that I had not allowed myself to think about for 2 years, because thinking about them made the distance between that time and the present too large to bear comfortably. She told me things about the marriage that she had not told me before. Not because she had been protecting Marcus, she said, but because she had been protecting herself from having to hear herself say them out loud. I listened without comment for most of it. When she left, she hugged me in the doorway of the hotel with the force of someone who has remembered how to use their arms. I stood there in the lobby for a moment after she walked out, and the feeling I had was not the triumph that Marcus would have imagined, not the satisfaction of a man who has won a battle and punished his enemies. It was something quieter than that. It was the feeling of a structure that has been identified as failing, being stabilized correctly with the right materials applied with appropriate pressure at the appropriate load points. The situation with Marcus resolved itself over the following months in stages. The tenancy review concluded with a new rental agreement at full market rate, which Marcus and Sophia could not afford on their combined income without significant adjustments to their spending. They sold the Range Rover voluntarily before the lease recall was fully processed. Marcus had Gruber investigated through his own lawyer, which confirmed everything in Gerhard's research file, and initiated a process that eventually led to Marcus joining a group of Gruber's other clients in a civil action that recovered approximately 30% of the invested funds over 3 years. Marcus's professional life also underwent a revision during this period. The agency he worked for went through a restructuring, and his senior brand strategist position was made redundant in the February following the September of the coffee cup. He found another position 6 months later at a smaller agency at a lower salary. I'm told he was humbler in it. Sophia and I had breakfast together every second Sunday from October onwards. We met at a small cafe in the Heidhausen district that she had found and that had excellent Bavarian bread and very good coffee. We did not discuss Marcus at these breakfasts except when she brought him up, which she did occasionally in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting on the progress of a situation that is being managed rather than either celebrated or lamented. What we did discuss was everything else. Her work, which she was finding more satisfying now that she was approaching it without the particular performance pressure that had governed her professional choices when Marcus's sense of status was a variable she had to account for. My work, which I had returned to in an advisory capacity for 2 infrastructure projects that interested me technically and that gave my mind the structural problems it needed to feel operational. Her mother, the years in Regensburg, the mornings in the rain. We talked about whether she remembered the first year of the business. When I had driven to a municipal engineering office in Ingolstadt in a car with a faulty heater in January to present a proposal to a committee of 5 civil servants who had given me 45 minutes and had sent me away with a commission for 63,000 euros worth of drainage assessment work that had eventually led, through a chain of relationships and project deliveries that extended over 9 years to the Austrian Federal Highway Authority contract. She remembered. She had been 9 years old and her mother had let her stay up to hear how the meeting had gone, and she had fallen asleep on the sofa before I got home and I had carried her to bed. I told her something I had not told her before, that the commission from that Ingolstadt meeting had been the inflection point, the moment when the company became something that was going to survive and grow, rather than something that was going to be one of the majority of small engineering firms that fold within 5 years. I told her that I had sat in the car park afterwards in the faulty heater car in January and had been so relieved that I had sat there for 20 minutes without moving, just processing the relief. She laughed at this. Her mother would have found that very funny, she said. Her mother would have, I agreed. 18 months after the morning of the coffee cup, I received a letter from Sophia. Not a text, not an email. A handwritten letter on plain paper in an envelope addressed in her handwriting that I recognized from birthday cards and school reports going back to 1998. I opened it at the kitchen table of the apartment I had moved back into. The apartment on the Nymphenburger Strasse that I had sold to a buyer who subsequently wished to sell it back to me, which Gerhard had managed efficiently. The letter was 2 pages. It told me about a project she had started, a small communications consultancy she was setting up with a colleague, work that she described with the specific engaged energy of someone speaking about something that is genuinely theirs. It told me that she and Marcus had separated in April, which was 3 months before the date of the letter, and which she conveyed not as a catastrophe, but as the resolution of a long process, painful and necessary, and now substantially complete. It told me that she had found a flat in the Neuhausen district that she was decorating in colors that she would have been told were not sophisticated, and that she found she did not care. And at the end of the second page it said this: "Papa, I think I spent several years confusing the life I had with the life I was supposed to be building, and I think I needed to lose both at the same time before I could tell the difference. I'm not saying I am grateful for what happened, but I'm saying that the person writing this letter is more capable of being your daughter than the person who stood in that kitchen in September was. And I want you to know that I know the difference." I folded the letter and put it in the drawer of my desk where I keep the letters that matter. There were not many in that drawer. There was the letter I had written to Katerina on our 20th wedding anniversary, and the reply she had written to me on our 25th, which we had exchanged over dinner at a restaurant we loved in the old city, each of us reading the other's letter at the table. There was a letter from my professor at the technical university that I had received at the age of 23, and that had told me things about my capabilities that I had needed to hear at exactly that moment in my development. And now there was this one. I wrote back to Sophia. My letter was 1 page. I told her about the bridge rehabilitation project in Vienna that I had been advising on and that had reached an interesting juncture in the foundation assessment phase that I suspected she would not find as interesting as I did, but that I was going to describe anyway because it was on my mind. I told her that the apartment was good and that I had bought a new coffee machine that was probably more technical than necessary, but that Katerina would have found amusing, and that this seemed to me a sufficient justification. I told her that I was looking forward to Sunday breakfast. I told her that the person who had written that letter was fully capable of being my daughter, that she always had been, and that the capability had never gone away even when she had temporarily misplaced access to it. I told her one more thing. I told her that the morning I picked up the suitcase and walked out of the house in Schwabing, the feeling I had was not anger, and it was not vindication, and it was not even relief. At least, not entirely. It was the feeling of a man walking toward a structure that has been incorrectly loaded and beginning the process of removing the false loads and redistributing the weight correctly. It was the feeling of a problem being addressed with the right methodology. It was, if she would forgive the professional vocabulary of a retired civil engineer, the beginning of a proper remediation. Some things I wrote are worth building correctly. Most things, if you build them correctly the first time, do not require extensive remediation. But when they do require it, the remediation is always possible if you have the right structural understanding and the willingness to do the work properly. This applies to infrastructure. It also applies to everything else worth building. I signed it the way I had signed every letter I had ever written to her since she was 7 years old and away at a school camp, and had written to us on lined paper with a drawing of a horse in the margin, and I had written back to her with a drawing of a crane beside a building because it was the only animal I could draw convincingly. Papa. 1 word. Complete. I put the letter in the drawer to post in the morning, and I made a cup of coffee on the machine that Katerina would have found amusing, and I stood at the kitchen window looking out at the Nymphenburger Strasse in the late evening light of a Munich summer. The particular warm amber light that I had looked at for 40 years from different windows in this city that I had built my life in. And I felt the thing I had been working toward feeling for 18 months, which was not triumph and not satisfaction and not the resolution of grievance, but the simpler and more fundamental thing underneath all of those, which was the feeling of a man who knows what he has built, and knows it is sound, and is standing inside it on a summer evening with a good cup of coffee, and that is enough. That will always be enough.